But concerning that day and this generation. This is Robert Hilligans, author of The Early Date of Revelation and the End Times. For my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life. And I will raise them up at the last day. John 6:40. Topics considered. We will show the interconnections of the three topics listed below and consider the implications. 1. Walvoord from Matthew 24:34. Matthew, thy kingdom come. 1974. Walvoord explains what Jesus meant by, this generation shall not pass until all these things be fulfilled. He states, the generation, the one that Jesus was referring to, that sees the beginning of these signs, will live to see their completion. 2. The words of Jesus, Matthew 24:36, ESV. But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. 3. The words of Paul, 1 Corinthians 7. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. The Greek phrase, both Jesus and Paul use peri, literally but concerning, or now concerning. Matthew 24:36 opens with, but concerning that day and hour. Paul's usage in 1 Corinthians. This is Paul's standard phrase for pivoting to a new topic the Corinthians had asked about in a letter to him referenced in 1 Corinthians 7:1. It appears 6 times. 1 Corinthians 7:1 begins, now concerning the matters about which you wrote to me. The phrase recurs 5 additional times. From chapter 7 to the end of the letter, each major new section is marked off by this identical phrase, now concerning. Unmarried sisters, 7:25. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord. Knowledge and Judgment 8:1. Now concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Spiritual gifts, 12:1. Now concerning spiritual gifts, brethren, I do not want you to be ignorant. Financial offerings. 16:1. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. Coming delayed. 16:12. Now concerning our brother Apollos, I strongly urged him to visit you with the other brothers, but it was not at all his will to come now. The pattern is that Paul is working through a list of distinct questions the Corinthians had raised, since he'd received a letter from them asking about various topics. 1 Corinthians was his point-by-point response. We see the same pattern in 1 Thessalonians. In the 3 transitions utilizing the phrase now concerning, in 1 Thessalonians, a pivot is made to a distinct pastoral topic. 1 Thessalonians 4-9. Now concerning brotherly love, you have no need for anyone to write to you. 1 Thessalonians 4:13. Now concerning those who are asleep, 1 Thessalonians 5-1. Now concerning the times and the seasons. So, the use of the phrase is used consistently through the Corinthian and Thessalonian correspondence, Paul's standard way of pivoting to a new topic. The phrase functions like a rhetorical bookmark across the Corinthian and Thessalonian correspondence. Like these epistolary instances, which shift to a new subject raised by the audience, the words of Jesus function as a transition from the "this generation will not pass" statement to the separate question of the unknown day and hour. Application to Matthew 24:36. Structurally, all transitions support the reading of peri In Matthew 24, verse 36, Jesus is shifting from one chronological time period to a different, distinct one. From verse 34's Genea and to verse 36's, that day is not describing the same event. The dispensationalist position, verses 4 through 31, or 4 through 35, and 36 through 44, are treated as one continuous futuristic prophecy about a single future complex of events that narrow down to the tribulation and second coming. On this reading, peri at verse 36 doesn't introduce a distinct event. A circularity undermining real-time sign recognition in dispensationalism. Walvoord's move to reconstruct the words of Jesus common among dispensationalists is to define this generation, Matthew 24:34, as the generation that sees the signs, not the generation of Jesus' original audience, but whichever generation is alive when the sequence in verses 4 through 31 starts unfolding and is then completed. That generation, in this view, will not pass away before culminating in the second coming, and all these things are complete. But for that framework to function as advertised as something you can watch for, a generation would need to be able to say in real time, yes, what we are seeing right now are the signs, not merely signs-shaped events that happen to recur throughout history. And that's exactly where my objection lands. The text itself denies that certainty for the early signs. Jesus explicitly says, wars, rumors of wars, false Christs, famines, and earthquakes are not the end. They're the beginning of birth pains. Matthew 24, verses 6 through 8. Explicitly indistinguishable in kind from ordinary historical calamity. Every generation since the first century has had wars, false messiahs, earthquakes, and famines. The text gives no criterion for distinguishing this earthquake is birth pang signal from this earthquake is just an earthquake until you already know the outcome, which is precisely the retrospective only knowledge needed. The reason we know they are signs is that Jesus mentions them as signs that will be seen during the time of this generation. By contrast, if these events occur before this generation shall not pass, read literally as Jesus directly addressing his own disciples, they are true signs because their occurrence is restricted to this generation, which we know will not pass until all these things take place. When the Roman armies surround Jerusalem, it is time to flee to the mountains. All the signs have been fulfilled. The same type of catastrophic events observed after this generation passes away are not signs in this same sense, because they fall outside the lifespan of the generation Jesus was addressing. Jesus implies that there will be no more signs relating to the timing of his coming. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Matthew 24:36. Dispensationalist. Extending to the final sign, the supposedly clearer sign. The one sign dispensationalists usually treat as unambiguous the abomination of desolation. Matthew 24:15 doesn't actually escape the problem. To identify an event as the abomination of desolation in real time, you need a prior, correct theological identification of who the desolator is, the construction of a future temple, and what act counts as desolating. Even this clear sign requires an interpretive judgment call that carries the same retrospective verification problem as the earlier ones. You don't get certainty as to the identity of the abomination of desolation until you see what follows from it. But what follows is the very thing the sign was supposed to let you anticipate. The true signs being observed define the identity of the generation, but the certainty of the signs, as true signs, is not known until their completion. Once we know they are the true signs, then we can determine if the generation we are in is that generation. It is not just that the future day and hour of the second coming of Christ that is withheld, which futurists already concede. It's that the status of any given event as a genuine sign is itself only confirmable after the fact, at the very point the sign has already ceased to be useful as advance warning. That collapses the practical distinction dispensationalism wants to draw between we can't know the day and hour, but we can know the general season generation, because the season or generation identification depends on sign recognition that's subject to the same after-the-fact only verification problem. How a dispensationalist would likely respond, and why it doesn't fully escape the problem. The strongest countermove available is probably convergence. No single sign proves anything, but the unprecedented simultaneous clustering of signs, Israel's national restoration, temple rebuilding movements, particular geopolitical alignments, gives cumulative probabilistic confidence even without certainty. You don't need each sign individually verified, just the pattern as a whole to be sufficiently distinctive. This is roughly Hal Lindsey's interpretation of the 1948 fig tree generation, and it's the most defensible version of the position. But this doesn't actually solve the problem, it just softens it into a probability question rather than a certainty question and probability claims about its own moment. Unprecedented convergence is exactly what every prophecy-watching generation since the first century has claimed about its own moment. That's a track record we see directly. 1948, 1967, 1988. Lindsey's own 40 years from the 1948 calculation, and others were each confidently asserted as the convergence each subsequently required walking back, which is itself empirical evidence that convergence confidence doesn't reliably distinguish real fulfillment from apparent fulfillment in real time. What began as a single Greek phrase, peri, now concerning, turns out to carry more theological weight than its two words suggest. Across Paul's letters, the phrase reliably marks a hard pivot, a new question, a new topic, a new referent. That consistency is the strongest grammatical argument that Matthew 24:36 does the same thing, that Jesus moves from this generation, we'll see it, verse 34, to a genuinely separate question of ultimate timing, verse 36, rather than continuing to describe the same event under a different aspect. Dispensationalists resist that division for a structural reason. Their system needs verses 4 through 44 to be one continuous prophecy, because splitting it costs them the ability to treat this generation as a still future sign-triggered clock. But holding that line creates the deeper problem we traced out. If the signs of verse 4 through 34 and the words of verse 36 through verse 44 belong to the same unbroken prophecy, then knowing you're in that generation requires first knowing the signs are genuine, and genuineness is only confirmable after the events have run their course. The result is a framework that promises watchfulness but can only deliver retrospection. Certainty arrives exactly when it's no longer useful. The convergence argument softens this from a certainty problem to a probability problem, but the track record, 1948, 1967, 1988, and beyond shows that confident convergence claims have recurred every generation. This brings us back to the beginning with Walvoord's reconstruction of the words of Jesus. In review, Walvoord explained what Jesus meant by, "This generation shall not pass until all these things be fulfilled." Walvoord states, "The generation, the one that Jesus sees down the corridor of time, that sees the beginning of these signs, will live to see their completion." A. This generation is, so we know in advance, is the generation that sees the signs begin, the generation Jesus refers to. B. That generation will survive until all the signs are completed. So, the identity of the generation, as the generation Jesus refers to, Clause A is determined by the fulfillment of the signs, Clause B. This makes Clause B dependent on Clause A as well. This circularity resolves into two clean dependencies. Clause A, which generation Jesus meant, is fixed only once. Clause B, the signs reaching completion, has occurred. But Clause B can only be recognized as fulfillment of the prophecy once. Clause A has already identified the correct generation to watch. Each clause needs the other to be established first. That is a vicious circle, and it is native to the dispensationalist model specifically, because that model leaves the referent of this generation open to be filled in by whichever future generation happens to match the pattern. The reading where Jesus speaks directly to his disciples does not inherit this circle because it does not leave Clause A open. Jesus is not speaking of a generation yet to be identified. He is speaking in the second person to the disciples in front of him, the same audience, asking, "When will these things be?" in Matthew 24, verse 3. The same audience told in the Luke 21, verses 20 through 22 parallel to watch for armies surrounding Jerusalem and flee when they see it. The referent of this generation is fixed by grammar and audience before a single sign appears, not derived from the signs themselves. Nothing needs verifying in hindsight to know who this generation is. The text already names them. That removes the circularity entirely, and it also reframes what the AD 70 destruction is doing in the argument. It is not a sign the disciples had to first authenticate against rival candidates, the way a floating future generation must authenticate the abomination of desolation, the Antichrist, or a rebuilt temple. It is the dated fulfillment of a promise made to a fixed, known audience with a fixed, known outer boundary, the lifespan of one generation. Josephus's account of the siege, the famine, the flight of the Jerusalem church to Pella, and the temple's burning in AD 70 stand as historical confirmation of a prophecy whose recipients never had to guess whether they were that generation, because Jesus had already told them they were. This is where the peri pattern from Paul closes the loop. If the phrase reliably marks a hard pivot to a new referent everywhere else it occurs in the New Testament, then Matthew 24:36 pivots away from the near-term judgment of verses 4 through 34 to the separate, permanently withheld question of the Parousia's day and hour, not because the near-term material is somehow also uncertain, but because the discourse itself distinguishes a knowable, dated event, verse 34, from an unknowable, undated one, verse 36. Dispensationalism has to erase that grammatical seam to keep its floating generation afloat. With Jesus giving the discourse directly to the disciples standing in front of him, the seam doesn't need to be erased. The seam is exactly where the text stops making a promise about this generation and starts making a different kind of statement about a day no one, including the Son, was given to know. And this is why everything Jesus said before the words, "But concerning that day and hour," in Matthew 24, truly matters. He was not opening a new section about our future. He was closing his explanation of their present. Every sign he listed, the wars, the rumors of wars, the famines, the earthquakes, the persecutions, the false messiahs, the gospel going out through the known world, and even the abomination of desolation, belonged to the generation he was speaking to. These were not vague predictions waiting for a modern fulfillment. They were concrete markers tied to the final days of the Second Temple, fulfilled in the years leading up to AD 70, to lift that prophecy out of its historical fulfillment and attach it to today's headlines is to miss the precision of Jesus' words and the faithfulness of his warnings. So when Jesus finally says, "But concerning that day and hour," he is shifting from their imminent judgment to the timeless call for all disciples to remain watchful. Misreading these prophecies as predictions about modern leaders or current wars only distracts from the real message. Jesus' words came true. His warnings were accurate, and his call to readiness is spiritual, not political. The fulfilled prophecies of Matthew 24 are not a roadmap for our future, but a testimony to his authority in history and the providential care of his own. One's interpretation of the words of Jesus, "But concerning the day and the hour," matters.